We're resuming this series, as I mentioned, Running with Perseverance, and I had to be out of town last week. I appreciate you giving a warm welcome to my friend Eddie Sharp, but we are back in the New Testament book of Hebrews, and this passage of Hebrews that we're engaging together today has a strong word to say about learning from the mistakes of the past. Now, I'll bet that if I was to sit across the table and have coffee with each one of the people in this room and ask you about some of the most memorable, some of the most remarkable lessons that you've learned in your years of experience, I'll bet many of you would tell me about some lessons that you learned the hard way. Have you ever learned a lesson the hard way? Maybe for you it was back in your early adult years and you got tricked into signing up for a credit card. You didn't know anything about it, but they were giving away t-shirts, or they were putting your name in a drawing, or you could take home a toaster oven or something like that. And so you signed up for the credit card to get the free offer, but then the credit card came with some terms that you weren't familiar with. And so you had to learn the hard way about how powerful compound interest can be. And in the end, that was the most expensive free t-shirt you ever bought, right? Some of us had to learn the hard way. Or maybe it was a story about how your parents told you time and time again that if your car starts making a sound you don't recognize, or if there's a light on the dashboard that you don't think looks normal, that you should pay attention to that you should pay attention to the maintenance schedule that's listed in the owner's manual. But you got busy, and you got distracted, and you got busy to the point that eventually the car started making some sounds that you couldn't ignore anymore. Or maybe the car stopped moving altogether, or stopped stopping altogether, which is a big problem. And eventually you had to learn the hard way that preventative maintenance can be a lot cheaper than the major repairs, right? But that's one of those lessons. Mark Twain said, "Good judgment is the result of experience, and experience is the result of bad judgment." Some of you are going to think about that one for a second. But many of us have been around long enough to accumulate some experience. And our experience included some bad judgment along the way sometimes, didn't it? There are some moments that many of us wish we could have a do-over about. There are some decisions that we made that we wish we could take back. We learned some lessons along the way as we were accumulating experience. We learned some lessons that might have saved us some money, might have saved us some heartbreak, might have saved us some effort if we had only known those lessons before we learned them the hard way. But sometimes we just have to find out for ourselves, don't we? Sometimes it's like that. But sometimes there are these beautiful, precious moments in life. Sometimes there are these fortuitous opportunities in your life that come around and surprise you, but sometimes you have the chance to enjoy the benefit of learning from someone else's bad judgment. Right? Isn't that sweet when that happens? Especially if it's somebody you don't know. You know, it's just a distant thing. Like, it's not like you wished them ill or harm or anything like that. But you saw the ditch that they ran off into, and you're like, I'm not going that way, you know? Like, it is such a sweet thing when you have one of those moments in life where somebody else's mistake is so glaringly obvious that it teaches you a lesson about what not to do. You might remember one of those moments when you were in history class in high school, sometime around, February or somewhere in that lull of the year, those dog days of the school year, and you're in history class and you look to your teacher and you raised your hand and you asked that question that somebody asks every year in history class: why do we have to learn this stuff? And the teacher may have responded by quoting someone like William Churchill, who said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it," right? which is to say, if you can pay attention to the mistakes that were made in the past, you might be able to avoid some of those mistakes in the present and in the future. And I don't know if your history teacher convinced you about the importance of studying for your world history exam, but if you were wise, you figured out how to pay attention to other people's actions, how to pay attention to other people's missteps so that your journey could be more free of mistakes. And that's the skill. That's the muscle that the preacher in the book of Hebrews is calling on us to use in today's passage. You may recall from prior messages in this series that the book of Hebrews is not a letter in the same way that so many of the other books around it in the New Testament are letters, but Hebrews is different. Hebrews is actually a sermon. It's a sermon that was written for an audience of Jewish Christians. Now, I want to let you know that word for word, the sermon of Hebrews is almost twice as long as one of my typical sermons. And the preacher in chapter 13 describes this as a brief word of encouragement. I mention that just in case you ever start to forget how expedient and how concise the preaching around here usually is. But Hebrews is a beautiful sermon. It's full of rich imagery. It's got compelling metaphor. And in chapter 3, which is where we're centering our attention together today, the preacher alludes to a story that would have been highly familiar to the audience listening to this sermon for the first time. The preacher, like every good preacher, tries to come up with an illustration that the audience would immediately connect to. And so the preacher in chapter 3 recalls one of the most well-known episodes in the national history of the people of Israel. It may not be as familiar to you, but it was a story that was extremely familiar to the preacher's original listeners. This story comes from the years when the Jewish people had been freed from slavery in Egypt. Centuries before this sermon was written. And the people of Israel had been rescued by God, led out into the desert where they had made a covenant with God. They had said, God, we will be your people. We will trust your direction. We will trust you for your protection, and we will obey what you ask us to do. And in all of that process, after they made that covenant, God is marching them toward this land that God had promised their ancestors that he would give to them. God is marching them towards this place where they would ultimately find rest from their hard labor in Egypt and from the difficult traveling in the wilderness. He was leading them to the place of Sabbath, the place where they could experience the rest of God. But as the people of Israel neared the border of that land that God was going to give to them, they had this moment when, as a nation, as a whole, they lost faith in God's ability to protect them. They lost their nerve. They lost their confidence in God. They were at the border. They were really close to crossing into the land that God had promised. And Moses, who was their leader, selected 12 men to go ahead across the border and to spy, to go and scout it out and see how things looked. They were supposed to go in there covertly and come back with a report of what the land was like and what the inhabitants were like and what the layout was like and what the next campaign of moving into that land was going to look like. And so the spies on this covert mission were gone for 40 days. And when they got back, they reported to Moses and to the rest of the Israelites. They said, this land is perfect. This land is incredible. It's bountiful. It's got everything God said it would have. It's got everything we're going to need, but It's also full of large fortified cities and people who are very strong and organized and capable. It's got powerful groups of people in it. There's these 12 spies that come back with this report, and 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, said, no problem for God though. We should keep going. We should keep moving forward and do whatever God tells us to do because God has promised to give us this land and God's not going to let us down. That's what Caleb and Joshua said. But the other 10 spies said, no way. We've been there, we've seen it with our own eyes, and we're not going back. It would be crazy to go back. We're lucky we made it back. We don't stand a chance against the people who already live in that land. And what happened next was that the entire population of Israel lost their nerve. They lost their faith. They became terrified at the prospect of moving forward into the promised land. Numbers 14 says that all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to Moses and Aaron, if only we had died in Egypt. Can you imagine that sentiment? If only we had died in Egypt, as if to say that would have been so much better than this. Or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? They asked. And then the people stopped talking to Moses and Aaron and started talking to one another and said, we should pick new leaders and get out of here. We should pick new leaders and go back and tell Pharaoh we're sorry and just, go back to the way things used to be. And when Moses and Joshua and Caleb tried to talk them out of picking new leaders and turning back, the crowd came within a hair's breadth of executing these men on the spot. And the conclusion of that story is that because the people lost faith in God's ability to protect them, because they said there is no way that we are going to put ourselves in harm's way by going where God's telling us to go, God said, okay, have it your way. And God withheld from them the restful land that he had promised to their ancestors. God sent them back the way they came, and they were left as nomads and shepherds out there in the desert for 40 years until the generation of adults who had rebelled against God all passed away, except Caleb and Joshua, those 2 spies who believed. And in the generations that came after, this story, the story of the rebellion on the border of the promised land, this story was prominent in the national consciousness. Every Jewish person knew the story of the rebellion in the wilderness. It was one of the lowest moments, one of the most shameful moments in their history. It was an embarrassing error in their nation's past. And so from then on, the story of the rebellion in the wilderness served as a cautionary tale. It reminded the people, don't doubt God's plan. Don't rebel against God's instruction. They passed this story on generation to generation. They even wrote songs to tell this story. And that brings us back to Hebrews chapter 3 in the New Testament. Because in Hebrews chapter 3, the preacher quotes one of those songs. One of those psalms that you would find in the book of Psalms in the middle of your Bible. One of those songs that was written about the rebellion that happened all those generations before. Quoting Psalm 95 and crediting the psalm to the voice of the Holy Spirit. The preacher says, chapter 3, verse 7, today, if you hear God's voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the wilderness. We're talking about that old story, okay? Do not do what your people did way back then, the psalm says. Verse 9, where your ancestors tested and tried me, though for 40 years they had seen or they saw what I did, which is a reference to point out that these people had already witnessed many miracles. These people had already witnessed God's power over creation and over any other threat that had ever faced them. They already knew some of what God was capable of doing, and yet they lost their nerve. Verse 10 says, that is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. I mean, this is a cautionary tale. This is one of those songs that they wrote to remember and to pass down the story of where the nation went wrong way back then. And this psalm was written hundreds of years before the sermon of Hebrews was written. But even back then, the spiritual leaders of Israel were warning people, let's not make that mistake again. Let's not make that error twice. The next time we're faced with a scary situation and God asks us to trust Him enough to carry us through it, let's not be like our ancestors who doubted. Let's not be like our ancestors who rebelled. And so when this psalm is quoted in Hebrews chapter 3, every listener who heard Hebrews for the first time, every listener knew exactly what the preacher was talking about. The preacher chose one of those illustrations that the whole audience could relate to. Only now the preacher is saying, this is not just a hypothetical situation anymore. This is not just a cautionary tale. This is not just a fable or a legend or a myth or a story that you pass down to try to keep the kids in line, to try to teach the kids a moral lesson. The preacher in Hebrews is conveying this story in a new way because the audience that's listening to the sermon to the Hebrews is full of people who have reason to be afraid. The ones who are hearing this sermon for the first time are scared. As we've mentioned in previous messages in this series, the listeners that Hebrews was written to address were facing hardship and persecution because of their faith. Now, it's never been easy to be a Christian when Christians are in the minority, as they certainly were in the very first few centuries after Jesus walked the earth. I'm talking about circumstances where faith in Christ places a heavy burden on believers in their family relationships and in their social circles and in their business dealings. And in fact, there are still many cultures in the world today where the act of becoming a Christian, the decision to follow Jesus, means that a person is likely to be ostracized or disowned or rejected by the community and the family that raised them. And that's what the audience of Hebrews is dealing with. But I think, in a sense, it's not unlike what Christians in our context are dealing with too. Now I don't think it's exactly the same. I don't think it's generally looked down on to call yourself a Christian in our culture. Christianity as an identity marker still enjoys some privilege in the context where you and I live. But when it comes to actually implementing the teachings of Jesus, some of you already know where I'm going to go here. When it comes to actually following the teachings of Jesus, When you start talking about loving your enemies or our enemies, when you start talking about living a life of self-control and sexual purity, when you start talking about showing empathy for the poor and providing relief for the needy, when you start talking about showing hospitality to strangers and foreigners who need our help, when you start talking about that kind of stuff, even this church-friendly culture thinks all of that sounds a little extreme and a bit weird. And if you commit yourself to living according to those Jesus principles, even in this church-friendly culture, you will soon find yourself feeling like an outsider. Or you might find yourself feeling like a sucker. Or you might feel like you're vulnerable. Or you might feel like you're about to be taken advantage of. In a culture where you're constantly pressured to keep your guard up and fight for what's yours, you will be tempted to believe that the Jesus way of loving your enemies sounds stupid and dangerous and ridiculous and risky. In a culture where money equates to status and security, you will be tempted to think that giving money away is a foolish idea that could put your family at risk. In a culture where pleasure is the pinnacle of self-fulfillment and self-expression, you will be tempted to treat God's instructions about morality or sexuality as if they are antiquated rules that are out of touch with the real world in which we live. What I mean is that being a Christian may not get you killed in this culture, but living like a Christian can sure make it seem like everybody else is getting ahead and you're getting left behind. You may start to feel like you're missing out. You might start to think that you're losing. You might even consider whether you made a bad decision back then when you said yes to Jesus, and you might even give thought to walking away. But the preacher in Hebrews is speaking to anyone who doubts that God's direction for your life can be trusted. The preacher in Hebrews is speaking to people 2,000 years ago who knew very well the story of Israel's rebellion in the desert, but the preacher in Hebrews is also speaking to those who live in the modern day and who have a totally different set of stories that guide their narrative. The preacher in Hebrews is speaking to those of us who might ever doubt that God could be counted on. The preacher is preaching to those who might think about walking away. The preacher is speaking to anyone who might think life was better back before I made a decision to follow Jesus. The preacher is speaking to anyone who might look back to their former life, to the Egypt in their story, and think, wouldn't it have been easier if I had just stayed there? And the preacher in Hebrews is saying, learn from the example of those who made mistakes ahead of you. Learn from the example of the Israelites who long ago looked at the challenge before them, looked at the promised land and the fortified cities and the inhabitants and all of their strength, and decided that the slavery of Egypt looked better than what God was asking them to do. The preacher says, we all know what a dumb decision that was. We all know how much they regretted their error. We've grown up telling this story, the preacher says to his Jewish Christian audience. We've grown up telling this story to each other about the grave mistake, about the terrible error that they made. And those who are wise learn from the mistakes of others who have gone before so they don't make the same mistakes themselves. This is what wisdom looks like. And that's why the preacher says in the next paragraph that we should watch out for one another. That we should look out for one another so that none of us decides to give up. Beginning in chapter 3, verse 12, and this is the passage I want to make sure you mark in your own Bible if you've got it open today. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, the preacher says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart." Now, sinful and unbelieving don't always seem synonymous with each other, but the truth is that either one of those can make you walk away. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, which is to say, as long as you have the chance, as long as there's still time. Encourage one another daily so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. The preacher is saying, look to the past. Look to the errors, the mistakes, the pitfalls that people fell into in the past, and don't be like those people who traveled so far with God, who saw God do so much for them, who made a covenant promise with God, who saw God lead them through dangers, walk them across the sea on dry land, provide food for them in the wilderness, provide water for them when they were famished, who did everything that they needed. Don't be like those people who watched God do all of that only to give up right when they were on the cusp of realizing the promise of God's rest. The preacher says, encourage one another. Prop one another up. In fact, the preacher says to do this daily, while you still have the chance. Because on your own, your heart might get deceived. On your own, your heart might get distracted, and you might end up choosing to follow your own instincts instead of following God's leading. You see, what the preacher wants us to know is that Jesus was not calling us to a road that was easy, but Jesus was calling us to a journey that is worth it. Verse 14, the preacher says, we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. A number of years ago, when I was working in student ministry here in this church family, myself and a few adult volunteers who are in the room and still recovering along with me took a handful of students on a trip to Colorado where we were going to climb one of the mountain peaks that's over 14,000 feet tall. And we trained for this at Fort Worth elevation. And we drove to Colorado with so much excitement built up. And we packed our bags and we tried them on and we thought, well, these are heavy, but it's okay. We've trained for this. And then we drove a few thousand feet higher, and we got out of the bus, and we put on the packs, and we started walking, and it wasn't long before many of us started to think, I'm not sure I can do this. The kids were more vocal about it. The adults were less vocal, maybe because of the lack of oxygen. Maybe because we were trying to put on a brave face. But in moments of isolation with just one another, the adults and I would look at each other and say, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm not sure I can do this. My training was not enough. I wonder if I could just go back to the bus and wait a few days for y'all to get back. Those are the conversations that we had. Everybody was discouraged on the way up. Everybody except the guides. These young, spry college kids who had devoted their entire summer to taking groups up and down these mountains. And the guides who had been there before, who had seen the view from the peak, who knew what was in store for us, kept saying, don't quit. Don't give up. Don't turn back. Because when you keep going, if you keep going, you're going to get to see something that hardly anybody gets to see. And they kept encouraging us. And they kept propping us up, and sometimes one of them would walk behind us and lift up on our backpack and carry the weight for a couple of 100 yards, and sometimes one of them would take something off of our backpacks and help us to carry it. They were encouraging us every step of the way, but they wouldn't let us quit because they knew we were going to get up there and see something that hardly anybody gets to see. And I'm so glad we made it. It was worth every step. We sang this song in church when I was growing up. Really simple song. Lyrics were not complex. You could memorize it as I say it right now. But the lyrics said, I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. And what's the next phrase? No turning back. I've decided to follow Jesus, and I'm not going back. And so there's a lot of messages, there's a lot of lessons that we could take from this text. We could hear the preacher themselves trying to be the encourager for us. We could hear the preacher as if the preacher is one of those guides walking up the mountain with us and saying, don't quit, let me help carry the load, give me some of your weight, let me do something to help encourage you. We could hear the preacher speaking directly to us individually, or we could hear the preacher challenging us to be the ones who encourage one another. And that's what I wonder about, is if we believe, if we've decided to follow Jesus, if we've decided that He can be trusted, if we've decided that the journey will be worth it, that we're going to get to see something that not everybody gets to see, if we've decided to follow Jesus and we've decided not to turn back, what are we doing to make sure that nobody else turns back either? What are you going to do? What can you do? What's God calling you to do? To be somebody who says, I'm not turning back and I'm not letting you go back either. We're moving forward. Like Joshua and Caleb, we're moving forward. We're trusting that the God who has provided for us in the past, the God who divided the sea, the God who provided the manna, the God who provided water from the rock, the God who did it all, who led us by fire at night and a cloud during the day, we're trusting that that God is more powerful than the scarier things up ahead. If we've decided to follow Jesus, and if we've decided we're not turning back, then how are we going to make sure we bring each other along? See, I think that's what church is all about. That's what this whole endeavor, this whole gathering, this whole family is all about. And I want to clue you into this one thing. I know I'm running up on the end of my time. I want to clue you into this one thing before I get off the platform. I cannot leave you without telling you this. That if your experience with the church is to sit in rows or to sit and watch online and to listen to what I have written hopefully with the Spirit's guidance, and then leave, and that's your church experience, then you're missing what this is about. Because what this is about locking arms with each other and saying that decision you made back then is going to be worth it. So don't quit. I've decided to follow Jesus. You decided to follow Jesus. Collectively, so many of us have decided to follow Jesus. Let's not turn back. And that'll be my prayer for you today.